Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you on Saturday morning in mid-October, and I hope that wherever you are in whatever time it is that you're watching this, that it will prove to be of benefit to you and that you are having a good weekend, whatever the case may be. I wanted to do a quick video today because I've been studying lately on the deity of Christ. And specifically, today I have a Jehovah's Witness acquaintance who comes around every so often. And for those of you who may not be acquainted with the Jehovah's Witnesses, their primary issue, if you want to call it that, is with the deity of Christ. They are Unitarians. And what I mean by Unitarians is that they are believers in only one person in the Godhead. In other words, there is God, Jehovah in their case, since of course they're Jehovah's Witnesses, then that's the name that they always refer to God by, and that's it. And Jesus is not part of the Godhead, but rather Jesus is the first and only direct creation of Jehovah. Everything else was created through Jesus, but Jesus himself is a created being. They use scriptures such as Colossians chapter 1, where Paul talks about Jesus being the firstborn of all creation. And they say that that proves that he is a created being, because otherwise he wouldn't be the firstborn of all creation. Now that's a misunderstanding of what the Bible means by firstborn. Very often, firstborn in the Bible has reference not to being the first that has been born, or the sequence in a or the first in a sequence, but rather the one that has the preeminence. And so in that case it talks about Jesus having the preeminence over all creation because Jesus is the creator, therefore he has the preeminence over creation. But that aside, I wanted to talk specifically about Hebrews chapter 1 and how that particular passage talks about Christ and his supremacy. And in doing so, it goes about talking about Jesus being equal with God, being God as well as the Father. It does so by quoting a number of scriptures from the Old Testament, specifically the Psalms, where the person being referred to is God or Jehovah, and so therefore it equates Jesus with that same person. So let me read for you, beginning here with verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Now, there's a couple of things here to which I want to call your attention. First of all is in verse 3, the writer says that Jesus is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And that's important for us to point out, because the writer is not talking about a simple photograph where you have an image of something else, but the image itself is not what it represents. It's like if we take a picture of a person today, the picture itself is not the person. does not share the nature of the person. It's simply a representation of the person. However, here the author goes to great lengths and is careful to point out that he is the imprint of the nature of God. So it's not just a representation. In other words, Jesus did not come simply as a representative of the Father, but he shares the same nature as the Father. And then he sat down at the right hand on high. He also upholds all things by the word of his power. That is deity, language of deity. Who else holds all things by the word of his power except God alone? And that's not something that God shares with any creatures. That is something that God alone is able to do, because God alone is the creator. God alone is the sustainer. It's like Paul was telling the Athenians in Acts chapter 17, when he said, "In him we live and breathe and have our very beings." In other words, everything flows from God, and without God there is nothing. Therefore, when the author of Hebrews here says that Jesus holds everything by the word of his power, he is equating him with God. Continuing on with verse 5, "For to which of the angels did God ever say, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you'? Or again, 'I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son'? And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, 'Let all God's angels worship him.'" Again, we see here the use of the word firstborn. This is a quotation from a number of Psalms and from 2 Samuel chapter 7. Notice that he says he brings the firstborn into the world. And again, bear in mind that firstborn does not have reference to sequence. In other words, he's the first, and then there's other sons of God in the way that Muslims view sonship, but rather he has the preeminence. He is the preeminent over all creation, and there's no other like him. And so that is what the quotations here and what the word firstborn has reference to. So bear that in mind, because it's very important for the purposes of the writer. Because remember, the underlying motive, the purpose of the writing of the book of Hebrews is to show the preeminence of Christ. Preeminence over his creation, preeminence over the law and its systems, the individuals who were part of that law, such as Moses and Aaron and all the priests, even Melchizedek, and his preeminence over the angels. And so the writer again goes about doing that by telling us who Christ is and what is his nature. Continuing verse 7, "Of the angels he says, he makes his angels wings and his ministers a flame of fire. But of the Son he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions." A couple of things to notice here. Number one, he talks about what God has said about the angels, but then he contrasts that with what he says about the Son. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe that God, or Jesus rather, is Michael the Archangel. In other words, he is an angel created by God. But notice here that the writer makes a very distinct and important difference between Jesus and angels. He says that God said of the angels, or ministers of a flame of fire. Whereas of the Son, he says, your throne, O God. This is a quotation from Psalm 45. Now, there's a variety of, or a couple of primary ways to translate this particular reference. One of them is, God is your throne. And that is possible based on the construction of the original. However, that, number one, would not fit the context, and number two, it really wouldn't make any sense to say God is your throne, because then that sort of indicates that you're sitting on God. Obviously not literally, but the imagery, the metaphor will lose its power and its meaning, because you'd be using God as your throne as opposed to God being the one sitting on the throne, which is what the writer here is trying to get across. In other words, your throne, O God, is the idea, the reference that Jesus is sitting on the throne of God. Therefore, he is God. A little later on in verse 9, it says, God, your God, has anointed you. Again, this is something that gives some people trouble, because they say, well, if Jesus is God, well, then how can the writer says your God? Remember that often the writers of the New Testament use the word interchangeably to refer to Jesus, to refer to the Father. Usually the Father is referred to as God, whereas Jesus is referred to as Lord. However, God the Father is at times also referenced to as Lord, and Jesus is referenced to as God. In Titus 2:13, Romans 9 and 5, 2 Peter 1:1, for example. And so that's simply the idea that they are more than one person in the being that is God. In verse 10, we continue, and you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed, but you are the same, and your years will have no end. To which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? So again, more quotations here, and this quotation comes from Psalm 102. The interesting thing about Psalm 102 is that it is a psalm dedicated to Jehovah God. And in verses 25 to 27, which is the verses that the writer of Hebrews quotes here, it talks about how God, Jehovah, laid the foundations of the earth in the beginning. And yet, notice that the writer of Hebrews here applies that very passage to Jesus, calling him, equating him with Jehovah. And again, the writer talks about angels, and again, makes a distinction between angels and Jesus by saying, to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool? Which is a quotation from Psalm 110. So again, there's a distinction here between angels and Jesus. Jesus is not an angel, according to the writer of Hebrews. Jesus is the Lord Jehovah Almighty of the Old Testament. And so that's a quick primer on Hebrews chapter 1 and in how it talks about the deity of Christ. And I wanted to do that, taking it completely in its context, because all too often what happens, cultists are very good at doing this. They take a lot of little verses out of their particular context, and they create a whole doctrine from that particular verse. For example, when we talk about Jehovah's Witnesses, they go to John chapter 14, verse 28, where Jesus said, the Father is greater than I. And they say, well, see, if the Father is greater than Jesus, well, then that cannot mean that Jesus is God. Completely ignoring its context. And perhaps we will go through that at another time, but the idea is that it's important to take all Scripture within its context. We've been studying on Wednesday night at the church hermeneutics and principles of interpretation. And perhaps the most important principle of all is the idea that we have to take scriptures within their context. If we don't take them within their context, then that's what's going to happen. We're going to be formulating doctrines that are completely alien to the Bible, but We have done so because we've taken a passage from here, a passage from there, and we've created a salad of, uh, of passages, and we have built a doctrine from those. So let's bear that in mind, and hopefully this has been useful to you. And until next time, may God bless you, and may you continue to study and grow in His grace.